The basement was cold, damp, and eerily silent when the police made their discovery. There, bound by zip ties, lay Jordan Farris, a handyman known for his hard work, honesty, and dedication to his clients. But this was no ordinary scene. Jordan hadn't simply been a victim of a burglary gone wrong. No, this was something much darker, something more methodical, something that at first glance seemed like an unfortunate accident, but soon unraveled into a sinister conspiracy. The investigation began like any other, a routine check after a call reporting a potential break-in. But as detectives examined the scene, they were struck by the peculiarities that didn't match the typical pattern of a robbery. No signs of forced entry. No valuables taken. What had really happened to Jordan Farris? Why had he been left in that basement, bound and forgotten? Then came the first clue, a single piece of tape. It wasn't just any tape. It was adorned with fibers that, upon closer inspection, would connect Jordan to a completely different home across town. This was no random crime. This was a targeted act with an intricate, hidden motive. The question wasn't just who did it, but why. And how was the truth about Jordan's tragic death tied to something far bigger than a botched robbery? As the investigation unfolded, more chilling details began to surface. The deeper the detectives dug, the more they realized this was a story of corruption, deceit, and a web of lies that extended into the shadows of a local construction scandal. Jordan's death was far from accidental, and it wasn't just the work of a thief. It was the consequence of something much more insidious. With each passing day, the truth became clearer, and it was a truth that would shake the community to its core. Jordan Farris was the kind of person who took pride in his work. A seasoned handyman, he was known for his reliability and no-nonsense approach to fixing everything from broken pipes to worn-out floors. For years, he had built a solid reputation among the community, respected by both clients and colleagues. His clients trusted him not only because of his skill, but also because of his dedication to ensuring their homes were safe and well-maintained. It was his commitment to this work that led Jordan to a seemingly routine job on the outskirts of town. A client had called him in to inspect some renovations, a task Jordan approached with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined his career. Little did he know that this job would lead him into the heart of a dangerous conspiracy that would ultimately cost him his life. As the investigation into his death deepened, the discovery of the truth became more complex. The initial signs pointed to a simple break-in, but soon the evidence began to tell a far darker story, one involving corruption in the local construction industry and a contractor desperate to cover his tracks. To uncover the full story behind Jordan's tragic death and the web of deceit that led to it, be sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Join us as we dive deep into the details of this case, exploring the investigation, the characters involved, and the shocking revelations that followed. Jordan Farris was more than just a handyman. He was a man with a family, a trusted colleague, and a network of clients who had come to depend on his expertise. Though his personal life was largely private, the relationships he had with the people around him spoke volumes about his character. He was a family man, deeply devoted to his wife and children, working long hours to provide for them while maintaining a quiet, steady presence in their lives. Jordan's reliability was a cornerstone of his career, and it was that reputation that had earned him the trust of his clients. One such client was a local woman who had hired Jordan to inspect her home. Their relationship was strictly professional, but it was also cordial. Jordan had worked on her property before, handling minor repairs and improvements. There were no signs of conflict, but as the investigation unfolded, detectives would uncover a crucial detail. The woman's house had recently undergone major renovations. The renovations had been overseen by an unlicensed contractor, someone whose work had been the subject of numerous complaints. This would later become a pivotal point in the case. The contractor, however, was not the only person whose connection to Jordan would come under scrutiny. Another key relationship was with his fellow workers. Jordan's colleagues in the local trades community had always spoken highly of him. He was known for mentoring younger apprentices, offering advice, and maintaining an unspoken camaraderie. He wasn't the type to stir up drama, but those who knew him had a deep respect for his skill and work ethic. Yet, beneath the surface of these professional relationships, there were subtle signs of tension. In the weeks leading up to his death, Jordan had raised concerns about the safety of certain renovations he had inspected, particularly with regard to the unlicensed contractor's work. He was cautious, insisting that these issues be addressed before anyone else got hurt. But it appeared that those concerns had not been taken seriously. This growing unease within the industry and his determination to hold others accountable would ultimately make Jordan a target. Unbeknownst to him, his death was the result of this very decision to act. The investigation into his death would reveal how these seemingly routine interactions had collided, creating a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. The tension in Jordan's professional circles, combined with the stakes of a legal construction, would eventually lead to a devastating betrayal that cost him his life. The discovery of Jordan Farris in the basement should have been a routine call for the police, a possible break-in, a handyman caught in a dangerous situation. At first, it seemed like an open and shut case. The basement was cluttered, items were disturbed, and Jordan lay bound by zip ties. No immediate signs of trauma, no indication of a struggle. Just a man left to suffer in silence. The initial theory was that Jordan had interrupted a burglary. But the more the investigators looked, the more inconsistencies began to surface, pulling them away from this simple explanation. The first oddity was the lack of forced entry. A burglar usually leaves signs of their presence, but the doors were locked and the windows were intact. Nothing was stolen, no valuable items, no tools missing. If this was a break-in, the intruder had no apparent motive to steal. Instead, it seemed like they had been interested only in the presence of Jordan himself. His zip-tied hands and feet suggested something more deliberate than a random attack. This wasn't just about robbing a house. It was about controlling a situation and possibly silencing someone. As detectives continued to examine the scene, they found another clue that was even more telling. Traces of fibers on the zip ties, fibers that didn't belong in the basement. The fibers didn't match anything in the immediate vicinity, but the investigation into their origin would lead to an unexpected breakthrough. The fibers were traced back to another location, a home across town where Jordan had recently worked. It was an inspection job, a seemingly mundane task that had raised some concerns for Jordan. During his inspection of the home, he had noted some serious issues with the renovations, problems that were not up to code, and most importantly, unsafe. The house was undergoing major renovations, but something wasn't right. The contractor behind the project was unlicensed, and Jordan had flagged several potentially hazardous issues. He had even suggested that these issues be reported, but no action had been taken by the owner or the contractor. In the days leading up to his death, Jordan had become increasingly vocal about his concerns. In his final inspection, he had made it clear that the construction was a disaster waiting to happen. Yet, no one seemed to take him seriously. When the police linked the fibers to the construction site, they knew they were onto something more than a routine burglary. They soon discovered that Jordan had been one of the few people to notice the contractor's illegal practices. His death, it seemed, had been too timely, coming right after his last inspection, and just as the renovations were on the verge of being exposed for their lack of permits and safety violations. The initial theory of a random robbery now seemed less plausible with every new piece of evidence that emerged. Jordan hadn't simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been targeted because of what he knew. As the investigation deepened, it became clearer that Jordan had inadvertently uncovered a dangerous scheme. He had been trying to do the right thing, trying to hold the contractor accountable for his subpar work. But in doing so, he had unknowingly become a threat. Whoever had wanted to silence him had made sure that his warnings would never reach the authorities. But what Jordan had done was more than just stand up to unsafe construction practices. He had become a pawn in a much larger game, one where power, greed, and a lack of accountability ultimately led to his tragic death. As the investigation unfolded, the detectives began to realize that Jordan Farris had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than a simple safety violation. The fibers found on the zip ties and the drywall particles on his clothing led the police to an unlicensed contractor, someone whose work had been a constant source of concern in the local construction community. The contractor had been using subpar materials and cutting corners to maximize profits, putting the lives of his clients and workers at risk. But it wasn't just his shoddy workmanship that made him dangerous. It was his desperation to protect his illicit operation from being exposed. Jordan had unintentionally become a liability. The contractor, whose name would later emerge as the key figure in Jordan's death, was known to have been involved in illegal renovations across several properties. The unlicensed status of his business meant that he had avoided the scrutiny of the regulatory authorities. In fact, he had been able to fly under the radar for years, using cheap labor and offering cut-rate prices that had earned him a steady stream of clients. But when Jordan inspected his work and flagged the numerous code violations, the contractor found himself at risk of losing his livelihood. Jordan had been adamant in his reports, warning the homeowner of the potential dangers posed by the unsafe construction. He had noted that the renovations lacked proper permits and failed to meet basic safety standards. More importantly, Jordan had taken steps to ensure that his concerns were recorded. His inspection report, detailing the flaws in the renovation, was meant to serve as a safeguard, but it was clear that someone was willing to go to great lengths to ensure it never reached the authorities. At first, it appeared that Jordan's concern for safety had merely cost him a client. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that Jordan had not just angered a contractor with a bad reputation. He had threatened the very foundation of the contractor's business. For someone who had built their empire on illegal work, the exposure of these violations could have been catastrophic. The contractor knew that Jordan had the power to blow the whistle, And it was this threat that ultimately sealed Jordan's fate. The evidence that mounted against the contractor grew more damning by the day. Investigators learned that Jordan had been one of several individuals who had recently inspected properties tied to this contractor, raising flags about substandard and unpermitted work. The drywall particles on Jordan's clothing were a clear match to the materials used at a property that had been one of a contractor's most recent projects. It was becoming increasingly apparent that Jordan had been an innocent bystander caught in the crosshairs of a man desperate to protect his illegal dealings. It wasn't just the safety violations that made this case so disturbing. It was the realization that someone had been willing to murder to cover up such crimes. Jordan hadn't just been killed to prevent him from reporting the illegal work. He had been murdered to silence him, to ensure that no one would ever know the truth about the dangerous renovations being carried out. The contractor's decision to kill Jordan had escalated a routine dispute into a full-blown crime, driven by greed, fear, and a complete disregard for human life. With each new discovery, the investigation gained momentum. For the detectives, the case had shifted from a possible burglary to something much more intricate and far more sinister. Jordan Farris's death was no longer just a tragic incident. It was the result of a calculated effort to preserve a dangerous secret. The question was no longer about who had committed the crime, but why the contractor felt the need to go to such extreme lengths to protect his business. And as the truth slowly emerged, it became clear that the contractor was not the only one to blame. Jordan's attempt to do the right thing had inadvertently triggered a deadly series of events, and the consequences would be far-reaching. The case had escalated from a simple investigation into a battle for justice, with the life of an innocent man caught in the middle. But the stakes were higher now. The truth was out there, and finding it would not only bring justice for Jordan Farris, but also expose the underbelly of an entire industry built on illegal and unsafe practices. The immediate aftermath of Jordan Farris's death sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community he had served for years. Those who had known Jordan were left reeling from the sudden, senseless loss. Family, friends, and colleagues struggled to comprehend how a man who had dedicated his life to fixing homes and making them safe had been brutally murdered in the very profession he had loved. For those close to him, Jordan's death was not just the loss of a colleague, but a personal tragedy, someone who had touched lives with his work ethic and kindness. His wife, children, and extended family were devastated. Jordan had been the pillar of their household, the steady force that kept everything grounded. To them, the news of his murder felt like a cruel and heartless blow, one that not only took away their loved one, but also left them questioning how such a thing could happen. The family was thrust into the spotlight of the investigation, with reporters and detectives alike seeking their reactions. But in the midst of their grief, they could not escape the harsh reality. Jordan had been taken from them by someone with a much darker agenda. The community, too, was shaken. Jordan's colleagues in the trades had worked alongside him for years and were accustomed to his calm, reliable presence. They were taken aback by the nature of his death, so violent, so unexpected. The fact that Jordan had been killed by someone within the same industry only deepened the sense of betrayal. Many of them had seen the red flags, the corners being cut, the shoddy workmanship, but few had been willing to speak out for fear of repercussions. Now, in the wake of Jordan's death, It became clear that his attempts to report the unsafe construction practices had not only put him in danger, but had ultimately cost him his life. Those who had worked with him were left grappling with their own guilt, wondering if they could have done more to prevent this tragedy. The authorities moved swiftly, attempting to piece together the clues left behind at the scene. As the investigation progressed, more details about the unlicensed contractor began to surface. His criminal history was not as concealed as he had hoped. It became increasingly evident that Jordan had been silenced to prevent him from blowing the whistle on the illegal renovations that the contractor had been running for years. Detectives uncovered previous complaints about the contractor's subpar work, but it had always been brushed aside. Until now. The public reaction was mixed. On one hand, there was outrage over the brutal murder, with local media outlets covering every development of the case. On the other hand, there was a sense of disbelief. How could such a tragedy happen in their own community? The case seemed to expose a deeper, more troubling truth about the construction industry, a system that allowed dangerous and unregulated practices to thrive, putting innocent lives at risk. Jordan's death was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was a cautionary tale about the consequences of ignoring safety standards and turning a blind eye to corruption. As the investigation continued, the community was left in a state of suspended grief and anger. The truth about the contractor's involvement was still unfolding, and while many hoped for justice, it was clear that nothing could bring Jordan back. For his family, the pain of loss was compounded by the knowledge that his death had been preventable. They could only hope that, in the end, the investigation would bring the contractor to justice, and that Jordan's death would serve as a wake-up call to others who might turn a blind eye to unsafe practices in the future. As the investigation into Jordan Farris's death continued, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with an unsettling clarity. Detectives had already established that Jordan's murder was not a random act of violence. His body had been discovered in the basement, zip-tied and discarded, with no signs of robbery or forced entry. The physical evidence, including trace fibers and drywall particles found on his clothing, had initially pointed to the contractor whose unsafe work Jordan had flagged during his inspection. But now, investigators were delving deeper into the contractor's past, hoping to uncover more clues that would definitively tie him to the crime. The contractor's history was far from clean. He had been operating without the necessary permits for years, completing renovations that had been marked by substandard materials and risky practices. While many clients had turned a blind eye to his illegal work, some, like Jordan, had not. Jordan's insistence on safety and his refusal to overlook the glaring issues in the contractor's renovations had put him on a collision course with the man who now stood at the center of the investigation. As detectives worked their way through the contractor's records, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. He had been warned multiple times about his illegal activities, yet had always managed to avoid significant repercussions. The system had failed to hold him accountable. The contractor's relationships with local authorities had allowed him to continue his dangerous operations without consequence. It was clear now that Jordan's attempt to report the unsafe conditions had been the catalyst for the contractor's violent response. His illegal business, built on the exploitation of lax regulations and cheap labor, had been threatened by Jordan's commitment to truth. The breakthrough came when investigators examined the permit records for the house where Jordan had last worked. It was revealed that the contractor had forged documents to bypass safety inspections, covering up violations that put future tenants at risk. Jordan's inspection had been a critical step in uncovering these fraudulent practices, and in doing so, he had unknowingly put his own life in jeopardy. He had become a liability to the contractor, who saw his silence as the only way to protect his illicit enterprise. As a result, Jordan was silenced not by an impersonal stranger, but by someone who knew him only as a threat to their criminal success. The contractor's desperation had driven him to murder. The crime was premeditated, the result of a calculation that Jordan had to die to ensure that his dangerous and unlicensed work remained hidden. Jordan's death was not only about preventing the exposure of the renovations he had inspected, but also about protecting the contractor's entire network of illegal operations. It was an effort to safeguard his future, his income, and his reputation at any cost. With mounting evidence, the police moved forward with their arrest. The contractor, once a figure of relative obscurity, was now facing serious charges: murder, conspiracy, and illegal construction practices. The legal system was finally catching up with him, but it came too late for Jordan. His family would never get him back, and the community, forever scarred by the brutality of the crime, could never truly forget the deep personal cost of this tragedy. The investigation revealed not only the extent of the contractor's criminal activities, but also highlighted the broader implications of a system that allowed such practices to go unchecked. The tragedy of Jordan's death exposed the failures within the construction industry, an industry where shortcuts, corner cutting, and a lack of oversight had put countless people at risk. It was a wake-up call for regulators, contractors, and the public alike. The consequences of ignoring safety regulations were far too high. Jordan Farris had paid the ultimate price for doing the right thing. His death should have been a turning point, a moment when the system was forced to reevaluate its priorities and take meaningful steps toward change. In the wake of Jordan's death, many wondered what could have been done differently. Could someone have intervened sooner? Should Jordan have been more cautious? These questions were impossible to answer. What was clear, however, was that Jordan had been a man who acted with integrity, even when it came at great personal cost. His actions were driven by a belief in safety, in doing things the right way, and in protecting others, even if it meant standing up to powerful forces in the industry. As the case reached its conclusion, the contractor was convicted, and justice was served. But Jordan's family, friends, and the community were left with the painful reality of what had been lost. A life had been cut short by someone who valued profit over safety, who was willing to kill to preserve a fraudulent empire built on negligence. The tragedy was not just about Jordan's death. It was about the many others who remained at risk because of a system that had failed to protect the most vulnerable. As we reflect on this case, we must ask ourselves, how many more lives are in danger because of unregulated practices? How many more victims will suffer as a result of corruption, greed, and the failure to enforce the law? The murder of Jordan Farris should not be in vain. His story is a stark reminder of the need for accountability and the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the personal cost. We invite you, the viewer, to reflect on this case and consider the broader implications. What do you think can be done to prevent future tragedies like this one? How can we, as a society, ensure that those who expose corruption and wrongdoing are protected rather than silenced? Share your thoughts with us, and be sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more in-depth investigations into real-life cases that reveal the complexities of justice and the human stories behind them. The investigation into Keith Cato Barnes's death had been progressing slowly, with the initial breakthrough coming from the bloodstains at the lumber yard. Yet, the case remained elusive, with the key to Cato's death lying just beyond the reach of the detectives. With little more than circumstantial evidence pointing toward Leroy Collins, the investigation had reached an impasse. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, through a piece of evidence that seemed small but would prove to be the pivotal moment in the case. The first crucial discovery came from the blood-soaked tarp found at the lumber yard. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood on the tarp belonged to Cato, but there was something else that stood out: traces of DNA beneath Cato's fingernails. The initial thought was that these traces could be the result of a struggle, but the forensic team's further examination revealed something far more significant. The DNA matched that of Leroy Collins, Cato's small-time lender. The connection was undeniable. Leroy's DNA had been found under Cato's nails, suggesting that the two had fought in the moments leading up to Cato's death. This discovery was a game-changer. While investigators had suspected Leroy's involvement, the DNA evidence was the confirmation they needed. The forensic team worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline, cross-referencing the DNA findings with other pieces of evidence, like the phone records and the soil samples from the lumber yard. They learned that Leroy's cell phone had pinged off a cell tower near the yard during the critical hours of Cato's murder. The evidence was mounting, and the case against Leroy was becoming airtight. Despite the mounting evidence, Leroy remained stubbornly uncooperative. His alibis seemed weak, and his attempts to deflect suspicion grew more erratic as the investigation wore on. But the more the detectives uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Cato's death was not just the result of a financial dispute. It was the culmination of a dangerous power struggle. Cato had been trapped in a corner by his mounting debts, and Leroy had seen an opportunity to exert control over him. It was a classic case of someone using their power to intimidate and eliminate a threat. With the DNA evidence pointing directly to Leroy, the detectives focused on building their case. They began to investigate Leroy's past, uncovering a pattern of intimidation and violent behavior tied to his lending business. It seemed that Leroy had used fear and manipulation as tools to keep his debtors in line. He had a reputation for being ruthless, and Cato had been no exception. The relationship between the two men, once based on mutual need, had turned toxic, and it seemed that Leroy had decided to take matters into his own hands. Leroy's financial records were also examined, revealing that Cato's unpaid debts were not an isolated issue. Leroy had been running a small but highly profitable operation, and the amount of money Cato owed him had been significant. It was clear that Leroy had no intention of letting Cato off the hook. In fact, it seemed that Cato's death was a direct message, one meant to instill fear in anyone who might have been thinking of crossing Leroy. The brutal nature of the murder, the way Cato's body had been disposed of, and the calculated effort to erase any trace of the crime pointed to a man who had been willing to do anything to maintain control. As the evidence piled up, the detectives began to see the full scope of the case. What had seemed like a routine murder investigation was now a complex and chilling tale of power, control, and violence. Leroy's motive was clear. Cato had become a liability, and in Leroy's eyes, the only way to regain control was through force. The brutal murder of Cato Barnes was not just the result of a financial dispute. It was a calculated act of intimidation that sent a message to anyone who dared to stand in Leroy's way. With the DNA evidence and cell phone data confirming Leroy's presence at the scene during the murder window, The case against him had become undeniable. The detectives were now preparing to confront Leroy with the evidence, knowing that this was the turning point in the case. The next steps were critical. Leroy had to be held accountable for the murder, but the detectives also knew that the investigation had uncovered something even darker, something that could extend far beyond Cato's death. The murder of Keith Cato Barnes, though tragic and violent, left a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate crime scene. For those who knew Cato, his death was not just the loss of a man caught in a cycle of debt and desperation. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of the world he inhabited. His ex-wife, once hopeful that time would ease the pain of their fractured relationship, was now left to reflect on the life they had shared and the man Cato had become. While the finality of his death brought some sense of closure, it also left behind a sea of unresolved emotions, regret, anger, and a deep sorrow for the man she had once loved, despite his many flaws. For the community, Cato's murder was an unsettling revelation of the darker forces at play just beneath the surface of everyday life. The underworld of small-time lending and financial manipulation had, until then, been a hidden danger. But the violent end of one of its participants brought the reality of this world into sharp focus. People began to question just how many others were living in the same precarious balance, trying to survive in a system where power, control, and fear governed every transaction. Cato's death was a wake-up call to the very real consequences of unchecked greed and violence. Leroy Collins, now facing charges for Cato's murder, would have to face the consequences of his actions. But for those who had been touched by the ripple effect of Cato's life and death, the damage had already been done. The justice system would deliver its verdict, but for those who had suffered, the scars of Cato's murder would take far longer to heal. As we reflect on this case, we are left to ponder the deeper implications. Cato's tragic end raises important questions about the human cost of financial desperation and the lengths people will go to in order to exert control over others. What do you think? Was Cato's death inevitable, or could it have been prevented? Join the conversation below and share your thoughts. And if you want to see more deep dives into cases like this, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more stories that bring you closer to the truth.